right, thanks. What I'm going to try to do is show you some basically old school phenomena and apply some hopefully like new school stuff to them. It's going to get a little bit technical, but I hope you will enjoy it nevertheless. So we all know what garden pathing is, I guess, right? So you have an ambiguous sentence, right? When little girl attacked the lamb, and it continues in an unexpected way, right? Remained relatively calm. So what would happen here is you would attach the lamb to attacked, but it turns out that that's actually not the correct analysis. There's actually two historical positions on what happens in these kinds of sentences. So one stance in literature has been that this phenomenon is actually relatively rare. It's relatively costly when it happens, right? So you feel the hit, like, you know, the sentence doesn't work and you have to do something. And that is somehow signaled by conscious processing difficulty. This position has been around for quite some time. Then there's the position that garden pathing is actually relatively common, probably predominantly non-conscious, right? So basically it happens all the time and you don't even realize it, right? Because sentences are ambiguous all the time. And the cost may actually be relatively small. And that notion has also been around for quite some time. And then there's a more recent proposal that basically says, well, all that garden path cost actually is surprisal, right? So it's just a function of how, like, basically unpredictable the word that comes next is based on the context, all right? So garden pathing under this view is actually nothing special. Okay, so proposal one focuses mostly on, I would say, incidence, right? How likely is it that garden pathing actually occurs? And the other two proposals focus mainly on cost, right? It happens all the time, but like how costly is it? Another complication is that garden pathing may actually be non-deterministic at the trial level, right? So even if we give like the same person the same sentence twice, they may be garden pathed in one case and may not be garden pathed in the other. And there are several models that kind of have this notion built in. Interestingly, if we assume a serial non-deterministic parsing model, we actually predict a mixture distribution of our T's in the garden path condition, right? So what does that mean? So if we don't assume a mixture, right, and we assume that our red condition here in this histogram is our unambiguous condition, and the blue one is the ambiguous condition, these have different means, right? And that would be just a difference in means that you could detect. But if we have a mixture distribution in the garden path condition, we should actually be able to identify a second mode in the distribution that is kind of the trials where you do reanalyses, right? And I don't know if any of you have ever seen like this kind of data. I haven't, right? But the fun part is that even if your data look like the first picture, you may still be able to statistically identify two modes, right? They were just, maybe they overlap, right? Because there's a lot of variability in the data. Okay, and in 2022, we actually came up with a model that kind of uses this mixture idea and kind of dials it up to the max, right? So we actually have a bunch of components of sub-processes. So we can ask, like, in any given trial, is the participant even reading attentively, right? So maybe there's a mode somewhere in the data where people just zone out, right, and read very quickly, and they don't even get what they're reading, right? And we can assign some probability to this happening. Let's call that P attentive, right? So if the person is not paying attention in a given trial, they'll, by assumption, have a very relatively fast RT, but if we then ask them something about the sentence, even like, is the sentence good or not, they will probably just guess, right? If not, if they are being attentive, they'll probably have a little bit slower RT, right? They're paying attention cost, and they will not guess, right? Because they have been paying attention. Then, assuming that they are paying attention, we can ask, are they garden pathed in a given trial, right? Let's call that PGP. If they're not garden pathed, so let's say they figured out the correct analysis like from the get-go, right? That can happen. Right? They should, again, be relatively fast, not as fast as if they had been unattentive or inattentive, but still relatively fast. And if we ask them, is the sentence acceptable, they should say yes, because after all, they got the analysis right. if they are garden path, they should slow down a bit, and they should pay a cost, which we call the garden path cost, right? And now we can ask, like, assuming they are garden pathed, do they now even engage in reanalysis, yes or no, right? So maybe there's like an option of not doing that, or a possibility of not doing that. If they don't do reanalysis, they probably end up rejecting the sentence and saying, like, this doesn't make sense, this is wrong, right? This idea is also has been proposed in literature. It's called triage. But yes, if they do engage in reanalysis, they'll probably slow down again, like even more than before, right? Or they may also regress and kind of reread parts of the sentence. And finally, reanalysis can be successful or not, right? So if it's not successful, you probably reject the sentence as being unacceptable. If it's successful, you probably accept it, because after all, you found the correct analysis. And we applied this to different types of garden paths, and we fitted the model to reading times and acceptability judgments. And today, I'm going to take this model that we already had and kind of extend it, okay, and fit it to new data. So I wanted to cover surprisal, spillover effects, comprehension questions, right, before we only had acceptability judgments. And I want to fit it to this huge benchmark dataset by Huang et al., who used SPR to study, among other things, garden path sentences with 2,000 subjects. Okay, so what we can do with the model, we can just add GPT-2 surprisal, which kind of comes with a SAP dataset, as a continuous predictor to PGP, right? So the beauty of this model is that for each of the probabilities in the tree, you can actually run a little regression model and put predictors on them, right? So we can figure out how our experimental manipulations and such affect these parameters. We can model spillover by introducing another process, which we call postpone, which has some probability, right? Which is basically don't pay the reanalysis cost at the point of disambiguation, but pay it at the spillover region with some probability, which the model is going to give us, which we're going to estimate. And we introduced a new sub-process to cover comprehension questions, basically. So the idea is, if I'm the participant and I got the reanalysis right and I have the correct structure, and now I'm asked, like, did the little girl attack the lamb? I might still answer yes if I engage in pragmatic inference, right? So maybe if the question is being asked of me, so maybe the girl did attack the lamb after all, even though the syntax basically doesn't license that meaning, right? So the full model kind of looks like this, right? So it's this tree structure where you have all of these junctions, and depending on which path you take in a given trial, which doesn't mean that you consciously take the path, right? It's just like, it's basically what happens in the trial, right? You will end up in one of these bins down here, and the magic is we see the answers that people give in a given trial, and we see the RTs, and based on that, we can actually work our way up to the probabilities. Okay, it's magic. We can use the data to figure out the probabilities, under the assumption that the tree looks exactly like this, okay? Okay, so what are the sentences of interest? This is the one I already showed you, and the unambiguous version has a comma. And the question is, did a little girl attack the lamb? The other version, the other garden path condition is the little girl fed the lamb, remained relatively calm, right? So this is where you have a reduced relative clause, but you don't know that in the beginning. And if you disambiguate that, you just add who was. And the cool thing about this data set is that actually these sentences, while having different structures, they're actually maximally parallel, right? It's basically the same words in the critical and post-critical regions. So this is very nice and clean and very good for modeling. This is what the data look like. If I just plot them, just plot the means, and we can see that the ambiguous condition is slower for the garden path condition across these two constructions, across the two regions of interest, critical and spillover. And the NPZ has kind of more action going on in the critical region, and the RRC has a little bit more action going on in the spillover. Okay? So we're fitting a bunch of different models in STAN. These models are hierarchical, so we have these adjustments, which you maybe know as random effects, right, on all of the different parameters, because people and sentences are different, right? Not everybody's the same. Our dependent variables that go into the fitting are the reading time of the critical region, the reading time of the spillover region, and the response to the comprehension question in a given trial. And the predictors that go in are condition, right, binary coding, ambiguous versus unambiguous, construction, so the different garden path types that I just showed you, and basically GPT-2 surprisal that comes for free with the SAP dataset. Okay, and we do model comparisons using approximately leaf-one-out cross-validation, and this is basically, this evaluates model performance on unseen data. Okay, so we kind of guard against overfitting in this way. Otherwise, you could say, wow, you're putting in all of these new parameters, so no wonder your model gives you a better fit, right? But this aspect that we're actually doing cross-validation with unseen data kind of maybe weakens this concern a little bit. And we have a base model against which we're comparing our complicated MPT models, right? Which is basically, so this is Elmer syntax, right? So what a normal person would probably fit, right? So you have your predictors and you have your surprisal, right? And we fit this to all of the dependent variables at the same time. And when we now do our model comparisons, so ELPD is expected log pointwise predictive difference. So that is like how well are the unseen data predicted by the model versus the base model, right? Which is the Elmer thing that we just saw. And it turns out that if I only put surprisal as a predictor in the MPT, right? Only surprisal. I don't put condition in, I don't put construction in, I only put surprisal in. That performs better than the base model, but what performs even better is when I put in the categorical predictors, basically, right? And when I put in the categorical predictors, so construction and condition, and I put surprisal on top, right? That doesn't actually do much, right? It's not worse, but it's also not decisively better. Okay, that's what the error bars kind of tell you. Okay, so all of this I basically just said. All of the MPT models are better than the base model, so mixture is good, apparently. The one with the binary predictors is better than the surprisal only MPT, and the full MPT is kind of on the same level as the one that doesn't have surprisal as a predictor in it. Some parameter estimates, right? These also come out of the model. So what about the probabilities, right? What is the model saying the probabilities are, right? So apparently in the SAP dataset, people are being attentive almost all of the time, right? That is this P attentive here on in the upper left part, so that's almost like 100%. Reanalysis success is about 50%, right? So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Garden path probability that's actually in the unambiguous condition is around like whatever, 13% or something, right? Which is okay for the unambiguous condition, right? I mean, we wouldn't necessarily assume that it never happens. Triage is relatively unlikely, and postponement is relatively likely. So doing the reanalysis in the spillover as opposed to the critical region is relatively likely. Okay, and this all looks rather realistic, I think, based on what the data actually look like. And then we have, so these are basically the intercepts, now we have our slopes, so how does the ambiguity manipulation, so being garden path or non-garden path, actually influence the probability of garden pathing? This is basically the sanity check, right? If I'm in the ambiguous condition, the probability of garden pathing should increase, and indeed, as the parameter estimate shows, it does, right, by about 20%, okay? And in this model, this is the full model, surprisal also kind of increases garden path probability, but as I said, the predictive performance of the model doesn't really benefit much from that. And the postpone probability is actually kind of lower in the NPZ, which lines up nicely with what we saw in the plot earlier, that the NPZ action is happening earlier than the MVRR action, right? Okay, so surprisal apparently has a small effect beyond the binary predictors. What are our cost estimates? Here I want to basically draw your attention to the reanalysis cost, which is somewhere around 430 milliseconds. That is a lot, okay? So the model is saying reanalysis doesn't always happen, but when it happens, like it really hits, okay? It's really costly, right? And the pure garden pathing cost, so when people triage, right, that's actually not that costly, right? So you're basically surprised by the continuation, but you don't reanalyze. That's not doing much, right? That's what the model is saying. Okay, so now we can ask, like, as a final thing, where's the MPT's predictive advantage over the base model actually coming from? Maybe it's the very fast RTs, right? Because we have that assumption that people are sometimes not garden pathed at all, or they're being inattentive, so maybe it's just like lots of like very fast RTs. Or maybe it's the very slow RTs where they're doing reanalysis, right, which I just said is very costly, which are kind of driving the advantage of the MPT and predicting the data. Yeah. So what we can do, we can actually plot the relative predictive fit of two models against the RTs. So what you see here on the x-axis is the RTs at the critical and spillover region, just all like bunched together, right? And these little hexagons are basically cells where, so they contain data points, right? So the darker the cell, the more data points are in it. So a lot of the data are actually bunched up here, right? But there's basically data everywhere. And basically everything that is above the red line, so I'm plotting a difference on the y-axis, is where the MPT gives you a better predictive performance than the base model that doesn't have the mixture, right? The Elmer model, right? That normal people use. And we see that basically across the entire spectrum of RTs, the MPT model shows evidence of having better predictive performance. I mean, there are some data points where the base model is actually better, but that's to be expected, right? Anything else would have been very surprising. But overall, the MPT model is apparently doing a relatively good job across the entire spectrum of basically RTs that we can see. Okay, so conclusions. I guess we can model garden pathing and reanalysis as a mixture of these latent, non-deterministic cognitive processes, and actually we can actually estimate these parameters associated with these processes, right? So we can actually put a label on like whatever garden pathing and say how likely is this, and like how likely is reanalysis, and how much does it cost, right? And I think that's a big step forward. I think the findings also show is that processing difficulty is also not always a smooth function of surprisal, right? Because we had surprise in the base model, and the mixture model is still better. And even the mixture model with the surprisal performed worse than the one with the binary predictors. And also, shout out to all people who work with LLMs. So maybe those, like, maybe the surprisal from the LLM doesn't do such a good job of accounting for the data because it doesn't have reanalysis, because it doesn't have inattention, and like all of those things that humans by assumption maybe have, right? As we've always hypothesized starting in like the 70s. Okay, and this is also in line with earlier research showing that surprisal actually underpredicts garden path effects. And in line with the proposal that reanalysis cost is actually a rare but large kind of thing. So it happens sometimes, but when it happens, it's kind of costly, as has also been proposed in earlier work. And that's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting talk. My name is Wei Jie. I'm from UC Irvine. So I have two related questions. So the first one is that I think this is a very impressive tool that you can kind of specify these latent processes. It's very powerful, but my question is, do you think it could be too powerful to some extent? Because you can imagine there are a lot of decision points as a researcher to make. For example, you may or may not include a step of attention. You may or may not include triage. You may or may not include the garden path cost. So the question is, in terms of like, what is the, for example, model comparison step that you can do to guide you as a researcher to specify what's the specific tree that you should use to model the empirical data? And the second question that is related to that is, you can imagine, since this is a very powerful tool, it kind of gives me the feeling that it kind of transitioned from an explanatory model to a descriptive model. Because, for example, basically you can specify any kind of step in your model and then fit the model to the data. But I guess the more important question is, you have all of these parameters, but maybe the important question is, what is the mechanism behind each parameter? For example, if you see a GP type effect here but not there, if you see a surprisal effect here but not there, how would you explain this? Yeah, these are my two questions. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, so regarding your first question, that's a very good point. So in the 2022 paper, what we actually did is we had a bunch of simpler models as well, right? So basically, we removed the triage, we removed the inattention, right? And what we found in the model comparisons was that like the kind of maximal model outperformed the non-maximal ones, right? And we're planning to do that for this model as well. Like we haven't yet, but it's work in progress, so that will definitely happen. And yeah, the other thing that you didn't mention, but like in principle, I mean, we came up with the tree, right? So that is basically a constraint that we're putting in, right? Yeah. And you could, of course, come up with an arbitrary number of trees that look completely different, right? And we wouldn't know, like, if one of those may be the correct one, right? But that is, I guess, always the case, right? We're like in an M-open situation where there may be any number of models that we haven't considered, right? But yeah, we can, of course, like within the space we're kind of looking in, we can look at the different types, levels of complexity, basically, and look at the predictive fit that they give us. And what was the second?
I guess the second question is, because the model, since it's too powerful.
Exactly, yeah. So that was kind of, I mean, yes, it's very powerful, and as I said, like it seems like magic, right? So we're figuring out all of these different parameters from basically just the data, right? But the thing is that actually we're constraining kind of the cognitive processes that we're assuming, right? So you're saying like, how do we know it's inattention, right? And the answer is, I guess we don't, but we put in some plausible assumptions. We put in the assumption, well, it's fast, right? And it results in guessing. So one would need to come up with a different process that has these properties, right? Or come up with a completely new tree that basically substitutes something else for attention. You know, so it's basically all of these assumptions that we're making, right? If you go down this path, then the result is going to be guessing. The result is going to be being fast and rejecting, for instance, or giving an incorrect answer, right? So those are constraining. Yeah. Right? And I think the fact that it still kind of makes good predictions, despite being constrained by all of these assumptions, is kind of an argument in favor of the model.
Yes, that's true, but I guess my second question is more about if you want the model to be more explanatory instead of descriptive, then what matters is it's about, for example, if you see a surprisal effect here but not there, what's the explanation for that? Yeah,
so I guess, so what we're also doing right now, and I guess, I hope like this goes in the direction that you're proposing, is we're actually running an experiment while having the model like in mind, right? So basically an attention manipulation, for instance, right? So if we have an experiment with an attention manipulation and we see an effect on the attention parameter in the model, then that would actually be a good argument that that parameter captures something about attention, right? So that's kind of the gold standard, I guess, if we were able to show that. But that is work in progress, so I can't tell you anything about that yet.
I see. Thank you so much.
Laurel Brum, UC Santa Barbara. This is awesome. I'm really excited about it. One thing that occurred to me, I don't know whether it's a good idea, but I want to hear your thoughts on it, is it might be interesting to see how numbers of responses sort out along the branches of the tree and their distributions, and then you can compare model fits by seeing if you shuffle the branches of the tree or remove some parameters, what do those mini distributions look like? Is that an idea? Is it a good idea or bad idea? Is that an interesting idea?
Yeah, I mean,
would that do anything for you? Because I mean, there's an infinite number of trees, and you could rearrange the parameters in any number way, but this one seems good. Like, it has a good feel to it, but we want to go wide more than just vibes.
Yeah. So like one aspect of that is like, as I said, like using the simpler versions of the tree, right? But that is still like constrained by our assumptions, right? And as you said, yeah, we can fit trees that basically don't make any sense at all and see if they still give us a good fit, which would not be good, right?
Right.
But that is
like, good that that's not happening, right?
Yeah. We're going to do that, and I'm going to report.
Tell me, send me an email. I'd love to hear it. Awesome.
Hi, fantastic. Really love to see these results. I wanted to know if you know anything about the discriminability between the different parameter settings. Have you done any parameter recovery things on this? Can you say for sure that like, you know that there's a really low proportion of inattention versus a really high proportion of garden pathing, or all of these sorts of questions?
Yeah, so I have done that. I mean, not to the extent that I'm going to, right? But I have tested like multiple situations and the parameters were recovered successfully, right? But it's like I implement the model and I like set the parameters and I have to generate data, right? So if it can recover that, that's fine, right? But as I said, like the litmus test is really like real data where we actually like cause people to be inattentive and then see if if the model can recover that.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks so much. This is really interesting, especially as you pointed out, in light of all of the work showing that costs of surprisal don't fully capture the cost of garden pathing. And so I was curious about how you included surprisal in the model, because as I understand it, it was only a predictor of what, the only place you tried to include it was as a predictor of whether or not people would be garden pathed. And of course, surprisal can capture all sorts of things, like it doesn't seem like there were even like word frequency or word length effects built into the reading times of your model. So you could imagine that if you thought about decomposing surprisal into multiple components, it might matter in different places, or even that just surprisal as surprisal could matter as a baseline for reading times above and beyond which these garden paths could occur. So I was curious for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we actually had a model where we included surprisal also as a predictor of reanalysis cost, and also I believe as a predictor of triage probability, right? So you could imagine like if surprisal is too high, you're just going to like not be able to figure it out or something, right? And those were also like not better than like the other version, but yeah, I'm not saying that there isn't a way of, as you say, decomposing surprisal and putting it in this model that makes it work, right? Definitely not. It's just like, yeah, the way we've considered it now, and many other people also like put it in their models, apparently it's not enough to kind of cover the data.
Yeah, it seems like even just including it as like a baseline reading time predictor could be an interesting addition to try.
Yeah, so just, I also did that, I think, and I think that also didn't do much, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. Great, thanks so much.
Okay, let's thank Dario again.